Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremanda for YogaUOnline, and I'm really pleased to be here today with Marla Apt. Marla is a senior level certified Iyengar teacher with 25 years experience as a teacher. She's taught internationally. In addition, she's published lots of articles in publications such as Yoga Journal and Yoga International. She studied under the direction of, among other people, BKS Iyengar and his children, Geeta and Prashant. In addition to her work as a yoga teacher, Marla has a background in public health, and she was able to design and assist in a medical research study at UCLA which handled the topic of yoga as a modality for working with anxiety and depression. Marla created the first yoga therapy content to be integrated into the David Geffen curriculum for the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. So I'm super excited to talk to you at this point in time, Marla, so welcome.
Thank you.
So one of the big outcomes, I think as we're talking, we're coming in on maybe a year and a half of the COVID pandemic. And one of the things that's really been a big outcome of this pandemic is from my perspective, it has shined a light on the need to address mental health issues, that mental health issues are more prevalent than a lot of us thought. And we've always heard people say that yoga is good for mood elevation or mood stability or, various mental distress. But I think it's only recently that there's been a lot of scientific metal kind of put behind that effort to quantify and qualify how yoga can be helpful. So can you speak to that from your experience, because you really have had hands-on experience working in that particular realm?
Yeah, sure. Well, in terms of the medical research, it's interesting because the first wave of research is really the question is whether or not yoga is helpful. And I think that as yoga practitioners, we just take for granted that, yes, it's helpful. And we know that it has an impact on our mood. We know anecdotally, and we know from our own experience. But for science to move forward, there has to be evidence. So the first studies that I took part in were about just establishing that, yes, yoga has an impact on mood, and it has an impact. It actually can change the trajectory of a diagnosis such as depression or anxiety. And then the next question, which you asked, is, well, how? And I think that question is still out there in terms of the scientific perspective, and research is still being done, and the more funding that there is for research, the more they can really get into, what are the mechanisms that how is yoga impacting the body, the brain, and neuroscientific research is still understanding what is depression, what is anxiety, what are mood disorders in terms of how they affect our entire nervous system. So I think that now it's been established, we can see that yoga does have an impact on our mood, and now it's starting to be revealed that, well, it has an impact on our mood because it actually changes our brain. It changes the neurotransmitters, that we can actually change the chemical structure, our hormonal structure in our body through the practice of yoga. And they're able to track that. Now, these are things that as yoga practitioners, maybe we already know these things from our own experience. But in order for yoga to be helpful for people who might not reach out to yoga, I think it's important that it's been verified, that it's been validated with evidence. And that way it can be we can further investigate this. And so it's important that it be replicable, that yoga is that whatever the approach is, whatever the intervention is something that we can repeat. And, we know that mood, mental states, emotional states are in our body, in our nervous system. And that whole interaction between the nervous system and the mind is really where the intersection of yoga is starting to impact us. And for a practitioner, for example, somebody who's experiencing something like depression may be feeling lack of embodiment, not feeling present in the body, or feeling embodied in general. And the yoga practice is one, using the body, using asana, is one that actually brings about a sense of self-awareness from the level of the body outward, to expand our sense of self from the innermost core to the outer periphery, to the outer world. And that's one of the ways that yoga helps us.
That's awesome. And what I thought when you were talking was, yoga is such almost a generic term in there. It's so hard, I think, at this point to say, what does that mean? And as you've pointed out, mental health issues can be amorphous as well. So how do you go about devising criteria for something that can be as amorphous? You mentioned repeatability, and I think with your background, you've got a science background. So how do you do that?
I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I love about Iyengar yoga, is I think it has a kind of scientific approach, in the sense that it's that it's really about examining, well, if we do it this way, if we do an asana, for example, with this attention to this particular aspect of the asana, what effect does that have? So we watch, we observe, and this is not just in Iyengar yoga, there's action and there's reflection. It's not just do, but you do, and then you reflect. And that's the aspect of swajaya, self-study. You have tapas, you put in some effort, but then there's this reflection, the study. And so with that, you get to see, oh, that's the imprint of this. When I open my chest, there's a more positive mind state. And then, oh, it has an effect on my diaphragm, and suddenly the inhalation became smoother. Oh, and then I feel how this particular asana, if I do Setu Bandha Sarvangasana, for example, how my abdominal region is softly lengthened, and how that I can feel that there's a calming of the nerves as a result, or the head in a particular position is affecting the vagus nerve. And so we can, through slowing down and observing, we can actually pinpoint what it is about each particular technique, and use those tools for targeted conditions, for a targeted approach. And it can be turned I mean, this is the approach in yoga therapy, is how to work with specific conditions.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Iyengar yoga, and you actually worked with Mr. Iyengar on one of these studies. Can you talk about that, and what his involvement was, and how you worked together with him, or under his guidance, I guess?
So I had spent time in India, and while I was there, and I had watched him working with students with different conditions. I was helping in the medical class there, or the therapy class. And so in that therapy class, there all kinds of ranges of conditions were being addressed, but some of them were mental issues. And I got to see how he worked with depression, how he worked with anxiety, how he worked with trauma. And so using that as a background, when I was approached to help with the study, I wrote down some sequences and what would be the approach, what would be the yoga intervention. I sent those to him via mail, and he replied, and he gave his input, and there were a few things that he tweaked about it, and then I kept him updated on the how the study was going. And then later I did a study on yoga for anxiety. And it just so happened that he was touring the USA at that time that I was preparing. And so I got to discuss it with him in person. And his first response was, well, anxiety is a form of depression. It's the same approach. And I was like, okay, so we'll just use the same sequences. And then really went into detail on, how it's really subtle things that you can do the same asana, but how you're doing it. What is the attention in the eyes? How are you holding your neck? So in the same asana, what is the support that you're going to use for depression as opposed to anxiety changes the entire flavor of the practice and the result of the practice. So yeah, he was very involved with helping design the sequences and the approach, and what were the things that he was concerned with as a teacher, as the teachers. I wasn't the only teacher in these studies. As the teachers, what it is that we should be looking for in the students and what we should be focusing on in terms of our instructions and bringing awareness.
So in terms of these studies that you have worked on personally, what's been your experience of the receptivity in the medical community? I know that, there are schools like the David Geffen School where people are more receptive to other modalities, but what's been your general impression of how much of a climb this is going to be over time?
I think there's a great deal of interest in this now. At the time that we did it, there were very few studies on this. Now we can see that it's kind of exploding, and especially I'd say I'm seeing a lot of funding going toward the field of mindfulness, which is a similar approach. But the thing about these studies is it takes funding. It's if you want to really do it on a larger scale. So it's helpful to do these pilot studies, and there's definitely a support for it, and I think researchers are interested, and they're also wanting to go where the funding is. So that's it's really a matter. I think it's important to attach yourself to be involved with good researchers, people who really know the process of research, so that you all the time and effort that you put into it, that it's respected, that the results are come through in a way that can be that can be used. And so having the right controls and all of that. So
did you find because you mentioned asana, and when I think of Iyengar, I primarily think of asana. Are there other, the whole ballywick of yoga, you've got all these other things that you can draw from. Is asana a really good way into mind-body health?
I think so, yeah. Especially when it depends on what condition we're working with, but asana, especially for the beginner, somebody who's doesn't have a yoga experience, the more subtle the practice, the less tangible it is, the less you have to grab onto. And for beginners, especially when you're dealing something like depression, where actually you really want something concrete, you want something that anchors you in your body, that anchors you in the present moment, anchors you in the outer world. And so for example, working with depression, we don't start with the breath, even though pranayama is a big part of the practice of Iyengar yoga. Breath work and pranayama it's incorporated, but in a very gross way, in terms of not subtle. So trying to bring out the things that are really common and universal, and that's our body. I mean, that's the one universal across cultures, and actually a lot of the research that's been done around mood shows that cross-culturally we have physical responses to mood that is the same in terms of how we feel and experience mood in our body. And so that that makes asana a completely universal practice. And so even though, yes, pranayama, other techniques, seated meditation, chanting, all of that is beneficial, I'd say as a starting point, asana is going to translate for anybody.
That's a really good point. I have never thought of it that way, but yeah, asana is for a lot of people the gateway to these deeper practices. But if you're not in your body, if you're other than in your body, of course, working with the body makes just tremendously good sense. So on the topic of coming out of the pandemic, because people have been in, I've been reading about it. There's some term I can't place it right now, but the kind of the ennui of we're all a little bit off kilter right now. What are some of the yoga ways that somebody might, I'm not talking about someone who really needs serious help. You know, I'm talking about those of us who are just kind of really tired of looking from the front door to the back door, walking around the same block and just getting a little bit sad or a little bit, you know, low energy. What might be some simple practices you might recommend for someone at home?
So it's interesting because the things that you've described and the things that people have been experiencing for the last year are things that are described in the Yoga Sutras that Patanjali talks about as obstacles on our path and afflictions that we all experience. This fear, the fear of the unknown, malaise, lethargy, instability. We've gone through the gambit of it, and then Patanjali kind of gives the antidote to it in this eightfold path, and specifically in asana. Actually, that's one of the practices that he says brings stability, brings firmness, and brings a sense of happiness and ease. So I think that, you know, one of the things that's also, having worked with depression, is knowing how difficult it is to just start something, to just get motivated. And I think that's something that probably many people can relate to right now, is just getting motivated to do something new, or to do something that's maybe in your own best interest, but it's out of practice for you. And so just taking a small step and having really achievable goals. And I don't even want to call it a goal, just to say, I'm going to do, you know, if I'm going to start a yoga practice, I want to reinitiate my yoga practice, or I'm just going to do one asana a day, or one technique a day, or 5 minutes of pranayama, something that you can feel confident that you might be able to carve out that time in your life. And if you don't, oh well, you missed it, and you can try again the next day. So to just take a small step, and any step in the direction of your own self-care is really powerful. That's the one thing that I took away from doing this research with depression, is how hard it is just to show up. And so showing up for yourself, it's hard, you know, when you drive to a yoga class and there's a community of people there, but to just show up in the same room in which you're working all day and parenting and having celebrations, and everything's happening within the same confined space, and turning that space into a sacred space of self-care, or a sacred space of yoga, or whatever that is for you. So I think setting some kind of boundary like for yourself, that's achievable. And I also think there's something profound about the isolating nature of this, that we can, in our own space, we can actually go withinward. We can go in and really observe. And so even if you only are doing a 5-minute practice, or you're just doing one asana, it can be, you can really listen to yourself in a way that maybe you couldn't when you're in a room full of other people. So to enjoy that experience, to allow yourself to go within and listen and see what you learn, what you hear, and learning something about yourself. And self-knowledge is an uplifting thing, even if it reveals sometimes difficult things like, oh, I feel so weak in this way, or I feel so stiff, or I feel so limited here. But even just having that knowledge of yourself, that interaction, I think is can take us out of this kind of dullness or this kind of haziness that many people are experiencing.
I think that's a really important point, to just kind of titrate in some movement and titrate in some practice, because I've heard from a lot of people that they feel guilty that they haven't, I've been home and all I do is watch TV. I'm binge watching TV, and there's really a lot of, the brain does have that negative bias, but there's really a lot of self-judgment that I didn't do this right. Isn't that always the case, though, in a difficult situation where you spend a lot of time thinking I didn't do this right? So just that 5 minutes a day is a really kind of a balm, rather than, oh, you should be doing an hour and a half. You have the time. You don't have to travel. And by now, why aren't you doing, 108 burpees in your sun salutations?
Yeah. This idea of never enough, and we can have that practice. We can have the same thing. We can become a perfectionist. We can be very achievement oriented. And I think, I think that we had a kind of pause. Many people had a pause in their life in this last year. And so that pause was also a chance to slow down and to be a little gentle with oneself. And I would just say that that's a really helpful approach in your yoga practice. I'd say for me personally, the first several months of the pandemic, I was using many more props than I normally use in my practice, just taking support and just feeling the need for support. And so giving yourself permission to do what feels good and to see what feels right for you, and not to push yourself. Because I think that once you get into the space of a practice, you will eventually start to explore, and that exploration will lead toward a little more tapas. And out of a joyful inquiry, you'll put forth some effort and maybe push yourself, but not from some kind of external idea of, I'm not good enough, or this isn't enough, or I have to push myself harder, or somebody's telling me I have to do this better, I have to achieve that. That's just a setup for it becoming another chore. But if you start with, I want to do something that I enjoy. What do I remember from my yoga practice that was my favorite thing to do? Let's start there. And then, oh, well, let me just explore, how can I feel even better in this? And then you'll find that leads you down a path of exploration. And I think that's not just now, that's actually how we always want to approach our practice, with this kind of joyful curiosity.
Yeah, I think that I was just thinking that would be, wow, that would be a great way to practice all the time. And I always hate when people say, when you're in a terrible situation, people say, well, something good will come of this. I just always want to tell people like that to just kind of bite me. Like, that is not helpful. But as you're talking about it, I think something good could come of this kind of pulling ourselves up and learning to enjoy our practice, and with a little bit of sweetness and a little bit of ease and extra props, as you say. Now, we're super lucky because you are going to be teaching a course in just that kind of material. Will you tell us a little bit about it? How it's going to be called, it is called Change Your Body to Change Your Mind, How Yoga Can Help Foster Greater Mental and Emotional Balance. So it's kind of what we've been talking about, but what will you be covering in the course?
So in that course, I'll be going through the more detail about the approach to working with depression and other mental states, negative and then mental states, anxiety, what we did in this research study, and how to practice, how yoga works from a physical, but also from a philosophical level. What is the philosophical understanding yogic philosophical understanding of mental obstructions and challenges, and what does yoga philosophy, what does yoga worldview, and what does yoga practice have to offer us as a respite from that. So we'll also be doing a practice that's really aimed at helping us to deal with these negative and more dulling mental states.
And then are we going to learn a little more about some of the choices you made in terms of the study, what you used and what worked and that kind of, I mean, are we going to get a little taste of the research that you did?
Yes, yes. I'll be sharing a detailed outline of the practice. We did 3 kinds of practice in the yoga study. We did practice 3 days a week, and each day was a different type of sequence. So I'll go into the theory behind that and specifically how it was done. And like I was saying, you know, it's not just what you do, but it's how you do it. So you can't just really give a list, a prescription of do this, do this, do this to help you when you feel anxious or to help you when you feel sad. But how are you practicing it? So I'm going to go into more detail about how to practice in such a way and why, so that we can understand what to look for in our own practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds really amazing. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for, especially for some of these ideas about how some of us who are feeling a little bit low energy can use the tools of yoga. And I'm personally looking forward to learning a lot more about that in your course. So thank you very much, Marla, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Lynn.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.